Are you looking for a podcast where you can hear from real people regarding their real dental drama? If so, then you've come to the right place. Join hosts Bethany Petty and Dr. Reena Kuba as we dive into the solutions we've created and the mistakes we've made while managing dental drama. Let's get started. All right, so we are back talking about a topic that maybe wouldn't be considered the most interesting topic, but I feel like it's one of those topics that is a heavy part of practice decision making, not only in the moment, but it impacts, what you do on multiple levels. And that is the topic of insurance. And specifically, I wanted to talk about this topic with you because I feel like you and I have walked through some things together from an insurance decision making standpoint that may be almost counter to what most people would do. And I wanted us to talk through our thought processes on those. But this is heavy on my mind right now because I personally have seen a lot of insurance changes post-pandemic that is becoming very difficult on the practices that are in network. And so I feel like it's become more of a red flag to a lot of practices that they may not have even had to consider before. They may have signed up to be in network and they haven't thought a thing about it. And now all of a sudden they find themselves in this spot where they're having to make decisions regarding whether they stay in network or not. And so I felt like the history that we've walked through on this would be helpful to people who might be in that boat of decision making on insurance. So I thought we could start with, I feel like a decision that we made, I guess it's a little over a year ago, year and a half, maybe at this point. You had built your practice on being in network with most insurance plans, so PPO, and then you were also in network with Medicaid from the inception of your practice. Mm-hmm. So yes. From the beginning. And you and I had kind of toyed around with dropping it at some point, and you made a decision about a year and a half ago to drop it. So I wanted the listeners to hear, what was your thought process? Why did you toy around with dropping it? What was your thought process on that? And then what ultimately just led to, okay, I'm dropping it.
So why did I take it to begin with is I think a good place to start with that. And just throughout dental school and residency, being a Medicaid provider, and then the practices that I had worked for prior to owning my own, we were Medicaid providers. And I feel, it was very, a lot of it was emotional just to say, hey, we provide a great service for a lot of kids that may not be able to get the individualized, customized care. And so it was a source of kind of pride for me to say that we are Medicaid providers and CHIP and all of that. So I think because I was already a Medicaid provider when I started the practice, I just was going to continue to be a Medicaid provider. It just didn't occur to me not to be a Medicaid provider, right. I suppose. And so fast forward to the last couple of years, it's just become much more difficult from an administrative viewpoint. Reimbursement being cut, and then the whole provider change.
Yes.
Gosh, when that came along, the provider change was all I could do. Like it just made no sense at all to me.
Just in case there's states that don't have to do that, do you want to describe what that is, provider change?
So Medicaid will assign you to a Medicaid provider, and usually it's kind of by zip code. So if the patient opts to not go to dentist A that they were assigned to and they want to go to dentist B, they can. But then whoever's the head of household, that person is the person who has to physically go in and make the change with Medicaid prior to you seeing the patient for you to get paid. Yeah. And so where that, it sounds simple. How hard could it be? Okay, just have the right provider change. And so thinking of it from that viewpoint is like, what's the big deal? But it is a huge stinking deal. And even years into being a Medicaid provider with the provider change, like it's not that it's new, but anytime you have a new employee that's not used to dealing with Medicaid and then they're missing the provider change, or the practice, it's summer break and we're super busy and we missed these two, or now a patient's coming in and it's not the provider that Medicaid has on file. So now it's another provider. Now that family is upset because they can't be seen. And I mean, it sounds simple, but it was the last thing from simple. And so from a practice viewpoint, that's something that it's one more administrative thing we need to worry about. It's one more thing that we could be focused on something else, but we're having to stop to do that. And then if we don't do it, I mean, we had surgery cases we did that we should have gotten paid $1,000, $2,000. You get paid zero because you weren't the provider that day. Well, they did the provider change last month. Yeah, but they needed to do it again this month. So just those little things like that. We were always being told something different, or at least, let me not put it on Medicaid. It was my staff who was always telling me, well, this is the reason, that's the reason. So whatever the reason, at the end of the day, it's still not okay.
Yeah.
It's still another burden to have. Yeah. And then more recently than that, it was the pre-authorizations and then the whole gamut with that. And also while fees being cut. So it just, to hire a whole extra person or two to stay on top of all this. And then you talk about we had it out of nowhere where suddenly they're trying to recoup fees from 2 years ago because we did a seal at 2 years ago, but then last year we did a composite. That's how decay works.
Yeah.
You try to prevent the decay. Family's not doing what they need to be doing. Now we've got decay.
Yeah.
Well, you owe us the money back for the seal. So it's like petty, silly things like that. That it's not just Medicaid. It's every insurance does it.
Absolutely it is.
There's only so much that, at some point for me, and again, for anybody who's not listened to the other podcasts, I do say, and I'll say it proudly, I'm kind of a princess in my office.
Yeah.
For me, I am there because it's the one thing I know how to do. Yeah. I was trained in, and I've got my degree in. I don't really have that many other hobbies, no other real skill set. I'm not good with computers or artistic or things like that. So my practice is my hobby. That's, I enjoy what I do. It's my craft. Do I need it to survive? No. I have set myself up over the last couple of years that no, I don't. And so, do I want a successful business? Yeah, because it's what I'm spending my time doing and all of that. Right. But am I going to let all of these little things make it so that I hate going to my office and that I'm bringing home that attitude to my kids and my family? It's not worth it. And so Medicaid was definitely getting to that part of this isn't worth it. Yes, there's a lot of joy in helping families and kids. There's a ton of joy in that, but there's also a point where we're having to do all of these logistical things and looking for staff that can do all of these things. And then it was just getting to be where this just wasn't fun anymore. Yeah. So I know for a lot of practices that need the patient volume or whatever it is they need, or they're happy to do it, and maybe aren't as sensitive as I am about the logistics. Right. For me, though, it's it might be kind of juvenile. It's got to be fun, or I don't want to do it. Yeah. It isn't fun anymore, so I don't like it. I don't want to do it anymore. Yeah. I sound like my 8-year-old. But I mean, if you can, you did. So
well, and I think even to that, it wasn't fun. It was becoming less and less fun every day. But also mathematically, it wasn't making a lot of sense either.
It wasn't, and it was still just something that I kind of turned an eye to because I loved, for the most part, our Medicaid cases were referrals for the surgery center, and then they would go back to their provider home, and I loved that because I loved that I could help a dentist, but then they would get their patient back. The kid got the care they needed, and I got to go to the OR, which I loved my OR days. For probably the last year and a half that I was a Medicaid provider was probably just because I just turned my eyes to the numbers. Yeah. And
because you were enjoying it.
Because I was enjoying it. Yeah. And that too, again, bigger practices or corporate practices that can get better bang for their buck with supplies because of the volume. That's not me. I've got a very small little office. So for me, though, to have to pay what I'm paying for products and supplies and systems and staff, it just really was not, it was really, I was hanging on because it was fun. It felt good. And then the pandemic hit. Yeah. And at that point, if y'all remember in Texas, it was really kind of the end of March to, what was it, like the end of May-ish, beginning of May? Mid-May. Mm-hmm. And so we were open probably 3 mornings a week for emergency care. And the majority of those were our Medicaid patients. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it was where an N95 was costing more than what I was going to get reimbursed for the visit. So we lost a lot of money in assessing, it was like we were already sinking because we were shut down because of the pandemic. And then we were bleeding money out because of, I still have to pay my staff to come in and handle the emergencies, and we're covered from PPE that was ridiculously, and then getting paid almost nothing, to turn around and get paid for the 2 emergency kids we saw with x-rays. We probably made $40 that day, which is a joke, right? Yeah. So it was just very eye-opening. And then again, when we were back open in May, to come back and say, okay, well, at that point, the PPE was still super costly.
Right.
I think just right around then is where all of our dental organizations were trying to get us a free box of masks or free this or free that. So it was just starting. But I was like, I can't.
Can't financially sustain this.
Yes, if I've got 8 employees and we all have to wear N95s that are all $8 a piece.
Yeah.
And then to see Medicaid patients all day and get paid.
It's like the math got to a point where you couldn't ignore it anymore.
So it was that, and then it was also access to the OR.
Yes, yeah.
It's still, to this day, we are now, where are we now? A year and some later, and access to the surgery center is still extremely difficult. And so there went the joy. I mean, it was totally a needle to a balloon. It was just gone.
It's a good analogy.
So at that point, it didn't make any sense anymore because financially, it was probably not a lucrative arrangement.
Right.
Probably a year and a half to 2 years prior to the pandemic.
Right.
But it was still fun. So it brought me the joy I needed, and it was a feel good.
Right.
Which a lot of practices can't have the feel good because you're trying to pay your rent and all of that. But for me, the way I've kind of set myself up, like I was saying, I'm a very small practice. All of that to say, it didn't make sense anymore for us to be Medicaid providers, which broke my heart.
Yeah.
I'd always taken such pride in saying I'm a Medicaid provider. You kind of coached me through, a couple of my colleagues coached me through and said, just because you're not a Medicaid provider right now, for one, you could always add it back on.
Yes.
2, there are other ways to also give back to the community.
Yes.
And I think it took me a minute to get there because that was one of my ways of giving back to the community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and a couple of things that I want to circle back to that you just said is, number one, insurance decisions, whether to be in network or out of network, it's not a permanent decision. It can always be changed.
Which is something I struggle with.
Yes.
For me, it's always all or none. And it's my team of colleagues, and you were the ones who are like, wake up. It's not all or none.
It's not forever. You're not making a decision that's going to last forever. You can change your mind and either go back in network or become in network. So this is applicable to, a lot of startup practices. To your point, when you started up, it was just, you were going to be in Medicaid. It was just part of the assumption that you made. And I think a lot of startup practices make that same assumption. I kind of have to go in network. And whatever decision you make, whether to be in network or to drop an insurance plan, is never a permanent decision. You can always change your mind. So I think that's a real valuable takeaway from the story that you shared. I also think another valuable takeaway is anytime you make an insurance change, there's always risk associated with it, right? So one of the things that I love about this particular story, and even looking back when we were having these dialogues back and forth about whether to drop during a national, worldwide crisis, you were making a massive practice change. At that point, we had run the numbers, and Medicaid was about a third of your production. And so if you think about this, just kind of taking all of the lens off, and you just go, let's look at the facts. And the facts are, you'd always thought about dropping Medicaid, but didn't want to because it brought you joy. Then this crisis hits the world, and you decide to make a massive change to your practice. Some people might look at that and go, what? That doesn't seem like that was a very wise decision. But we talked back and forth about it quite a bit, and this is a decision that we made that was very well thought out. Was there risk associated with it? Absolutely. But there would have been risk associated at any point that you would have chosen to drop a third of your practice off. And so I think recognizing that, yes, a risk is always going to be there, but sometimes the risk is not the worst case scenario. The greater risk when we were talking was your products and your supplies just skyrocketed. And now you are looking at providing this same level of service because we were unwilling to compromise on quality or standards or things like that. but your cost just skyrocketed. And now the greater risk is long term, the practice losing substantial money because you're seeing the same quantity of patients. They've come back, but now your cost of providing care for those has just gone up substantially. So the math wasn't making sense prior to the pandemic, but this just put a big spotlight on it to go, the greater risk is probably not pulling Medicaid at this point. Long term, we're going to see a bigger effect.
And honestly, for me, like, that's why I work with you, because you're smarter at looking at that big picture. For me, it was really very much, my assumption is, even the 2 years prior, where it was like, yeah, this is probably not a great financial stimulator.
Yeah.
But probably the work we do,
yeah,
the OR cases, probably kind of pays for itself. Like, so we may not be making a profit on this, but at least we're not losing a ton of money on it. Like, it's fine. For me, last summer, it was like, I will not be able to pay my bills. This is not let me look ahead, or let me, like, there was not even a risk of, what's the risk of dropping this insurance like we do with others, which we can talk about the other one I've done previously. But for me, this was very much like, I'm in panic. There's no way I can, am I going to qualify for a PPP? Am I not? Am I this? Am I that? Are patients even going to come back? Am I going to have the staff to see these patients? And I just, there were so many unknowns, but what was known was we'd had that 6 weeks of seeing primarily Medicaid patients, because a lot of our PPO weren't coming in.
Yeah.
And the Medicaid population was coming in, and just to very clearly see the costs versus the benefit, was just, so I couldn't even think beyond that. And so it's a good thing you were looking out for beyond that, but for me, I couldn't even look beyond that. It was literally like, I am bleeding money right now. It's not even that I'm not making money. It's I'm significantly losing money opening my door for this emergency this morning. Right. And where my, caring heart would love to do that, I literally can't afford to do that.
Yeah. Well, and the situation you're talking about is exactly what so many of my PPO clients are walking through right now, because again, to me, this Medicaid example is so correlating to something that I didn't project to happen as a result of this pandemic, which is the amount of changes that have happened in insurance. So you're talking with Medicaid, the reimbursement kept dropping, the hoops you were having to jump through, to get something covered was so much more. You're all of a sudden getting a bill from insurance, from Medicaid. Oh, you need to reimburse us for this. That is exactly what's happening with PPO insurances right now. So you've got offices that are seeing the same number of patients, if not more, and they are making substantially less. So they are having the same amount of staff. They're having the same amount of services that they provide. Supplies are still up. And all of a sudden, they've had this practice that worked pre-pandemic with the reimbursement rates that were in place, and now no longer works. They're going, I have no other choice but to figure out which company I'm going to drop or what I'm going to change to make this sustainable. So I'm so glad you described it the way that you did, because I feel like it's exactly what so many offices that are PPO providers are facing right now.
So then you add on to that, like now if you go on to buy a box of gloves, $40. What?
Yeah.
We pre-pandemic we would pay what, $6, $7, $8, maybe $14 if you wanted the bougie,
the fancy ones,
scented ones. Yeah, a couple of months ago you were laughing at me for Costco hopping. I was trying to buy a box of, because you were limited per one transaction, and I'm asking the Costco person, is this per membership, per day, per transaction? Like, I got to stock up on these gloves. They're out of control, and so. Just things like that it is. Our supply costs are still up. The glove costs have still not come down.
Yeah.
And then based off our other, what we've already talked about in a previous podcast is, here you go, the workforce.
Yes.
And so now, I'm having to pay, to try to keep employees and keep everybody happy and do all of that. So then the cost of labor
have gone up substantially.
And then now you've got insurance that is also denying.
Yep.
All the same stuff that I think insurance has probably always done to a degree, but now they have cranked
it up.
Yeah.
They have cranked it up. And so it's created an environment where offices that were perfectly happy being PPO providers before, not perfectly happy, they were good with it, are now all of a sudden not just wanting to be out, they're having to figure out a solution because it's not sustainable. Not to mention, some of the changes that I've witnessed in all these offices as I'm in and out is not only is the reimbursement dropping, just mathematically, Delta, for example, dropped their reimbursement on cleanings by $10. That is massive. It doesn't sound like much, but when the cleaning was being reimbursed at $60 and now you're making $50 off of that times however many hygiene patients you're seeing a day, mathematically that is massive. So yes, the reimbursements are happening, but also they're making it less predictable on their coverage. So they're coming up with new rules to deny things. I had one client that I stepped into their office and she said, oh my goodness, all of a sudden now they're denying fluoride because it was in conjunction with a perio maintenance appointment. What? When else are you supposed to apply fluoride? I mean, that's what the hygiene or the preventative appointment is for fluoride. But now that can no longer be done with a perio maintenance appointment. So then we're either having to have that difficult conversation with the patient that just says, hey, this is when we apply fluoride and you're just going to have to pay for it, or take up the battle with your insurance company, or we're having to bring them back, which is insanity, clean a room, get the appropriate PPE out, and spend all that money to make $20 off of a single fluoride application. So they're coming up with all of these weird and random changes, and those changes are no longer occurring one time or two times a year as it used to be. We used to be able to verify insurance, and it was pretty much, we know all the clauses, this is what they're going to pay, and there weren't really any changes until the next year. Well, now we don't know when these changes are coming because insurance companies are getting together much more consistently and going, hey, let's make some changes. We're still losing money. We got to figure out how to make this money back. And so we're going to make some of these changes. And so then you look at the staff component, and you kind of hit on this with Medicaid, the amount of time that your staff was having to spend to get something covered by Medicaid is now happening in the PPO sector, where you've got staff members who are spending all this time trying to verify benefits only to figure out the next week when that patient comes in that information is now invalid. They made changes between these last 2 weeks that is now incorrect. And so you and I actually had a conversation about this from the PPO side of things. I can't remember specifically what it was, but you had an employee on your team that wanted to continue to kind of press down and put the same kind of manpower into verifying every fine detail on this patient's insurance plan. And then you had one employee that was going, I'm doing all of that, and the information is still wrong. And so we were having to even make decisions in that moment of how to spread out the employee's time in how much time we invest in that. So what are your thoughts? What you walked through from a Medicaid standpoint is now happening to PPO providers. What would your advice be to them?
It's extremely tricky because, we're working very hard, and then, for example, Medicaid wanting to recoup the money on sealants, which means then the person that I pay, $20 an hour, whatever she gets made, to now sit there and fight this appeal and dig through notes and dig through the photos and do all of that. Well, you know what? The $25 Medicaid was going to pay us for sealants. Like, I'm going to spend more with you having to research it than I'm going to recoup. So just send them the check. Fine, take
just forget it.
But that's not okay on multiple levels. And so now here too with insurance, is it that you don't do the fluoride that you know is great for the patient?
Right.
Do you risk making the patient mad?
Yep.
Do you if you do bring them back, you're losing money. You are losing money bringing them back for fluoride. So where it's a challenge. I don't know that I have anything useful to offer. I think the situation you were talking about with the staff members, and the reason she was so proactive about making sure that insurance was very detailed and covered is because our patient population is very particular. The majority of them can afford all of this.
Right.
But by principle, they don't want to pay one extra thing because I pay for my insurance, and so this must not be needed. So it's that typical mindset. And so to avoid trauma from a patient and a bad review and spending time and doing to avoid all of that, she just become where she was very thorough in trying to figure out and really narrow down the estimate. Yeah. And I kind of see her point to a degree, because my solution was, well, why don't you just underestimate it? Yeah. If we're expecting insurance is going to pay $500, I would tell them insurance is only going to pay $100, and they need to come up with the other $400. And then if insurance paid the $500, woohoo, you won the lotto, here's your $400 back.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, from her point, though, she's like, well, then you've got the difference between $100 and $400, whatever they're going to pay, that they may not schedule if they think they're going to pay $400.
Right. Right.
But they will if they think it's just $100. And so I see that too. But at the end of the day, unless I'm willing to write off that $400 to keep a patient from being upset, and they all know, oh, this is an estimate only. You really might be liable for all $500. The insurance may pay $0. Yes, I know that. Well, then they're not happy when insurance doesn't pick it up. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I think for me, my answer was, I would rather just tell them insurance is going to cover $50. You better be prepared to pay $450. And if you don't want to schedule it and you don't think it's worth it. But I also am in a little different boat, because most people will spend it on their kids, and or when their kids are up at night in pain and suddenly they're back, and they're going to make this happen for their kid. There's a point of pain. Right. And so I do think for non-pediatric offices, I do see the challenge, and it's just, it's gut-wrenching, because here we are trying to do what's best for our patients. Right. And all of this is making it very prohibitive to provide a service. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, well, and I feel like, too, part of the conversation that you're alluding to is so much of this comes to the conversation that we're having with the parent or with the patient and how we approach that conversation. And in the past, we have been able to communicate with maybe a certain level of certainty. The insurance was a little bit more predictable, and we were able to at least give some pretty good answers to their questions. And so now, and you know this, insurance is so good at kind of pointing the blame back to the provider. We're always the one in the wrong. We did not send the appropriate documentation, or we did something, heaven forbid. I mean, we did something that clinically they just feel like we shouldn't have done. And so they have always been really good at casting this doubt on the dental provider to make it look like we're shady or we're not doing what's appropriate. And so we don't necessarily want to play the same game on that level, but we kind of have to play it a little bit. Insurance is very quick to throw even their networked providers. They want to throw them under the bus quickly because they look like they're really advocating for the patient in that moment. And we've got to kind of reveal the truth of the matter, which is, this is insurance's game. And we are clinically providing or recommending what is best for your child or for you, the patient. And man, we would love if insurance would choose to help you out with that. But unfortunately, they don't always do that. And that's insurance's problem. That's not our problem. And so I think it's important to, I think we've always kind of danced around that, and we've tried to provide the best information to the patient. And then when insurance doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, or we were wrong in some way, we've historically kind of eaten the bill on that in a lot of cases. And I think it's getting to the point now we just can't do that, because insurance is changing the game so much that we can't always be the one left holding the bag. Number one, supplies cost us more. Number two, staff costs us more. And we don't have the luxury of all that extra cash sitting in the bank to be able to just write it off or send it, like you were saying earlier, just to send it back to Medicaid. No big deal. It is a big deal now, and we don't have those luxuries anymore. And so I think so much of this comes to our willingness to engage in an open and honest conversation with the patient or with the parent that ultimately is attempting to shed light. And to your point, part of that conversation is let's set the bar low. Let's assume that we're not going to get much help from insurance. We're going to do everything in our power as the dental office to get help from insurance, but they very well may choose to either not cover something or to choose to pay far less than we expected. And it's better for the patient or the parent to be prepared for that.
So here's the next onion layer on that. One is the financial, obviously, part of that. But then the next thing I tend to see, exactly what you were just saying about how insurance is so quick to throw us under the bus.
Yeah.
And really, at the end of the day, who's going to believe us? So that conversation's never going to go well.
Yeah.
There will always be a seed in that patient's mind. Now, not just for if I was the provider, but any dentist they go to, they're always going to question it.
100%. Yep.
So it's soured right there. And then I start thinking about, from a liability standpoint, what patients then, well, it was not about the money. It was, I don't want this to happen to anybody else. That dentist is overcharging or is overtreating or is overdoing what they do. So it's not about, yes, the dentist wrote off my fee, but the trauma and stress that I went through, and I don't want any other patient to go through this.
Yes.
There is that is rampant.
It is.
So again, talk about damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like there's no winning this. I could lose all the money fighting with the insurance, so I'm double losing money, not only what I'm writing off, but then what I'm paying my staff to fight with the insurance. And then now it didn't help anyway, because now the patient wants to save the rest of the world from the horror that I am, this menace to society. So it's just a lose scenario. And so I think, like you said, our strategy is really to, especially even when we've got that patient who says, I do not want anything done that's not covered by insurance. I get that, sir, but I don't know what your insurance is covering.
Exactly.
So we're still not buying. So my team knows I've been so firm on the way we have written our paperwork.
Yeah.
Is you have to initial at each point.
Yeah.
And then patients will initial it. And it clearly says, I understand this is an estimated benefit. Like it's very clear. And then the patient signs all of that and then still says, but I'm not paying for anything that insurance is going to cover. I stop that immediately.
Yep.
Immediately. Let us stop this appointment, sir.
Yep.
I'm going to reschedule you to another day. Wait, what are you doing? No, because you've made it very clear. And I cannot guarantee one thing. Insurance is its own game right now. I have no idea and I have no control. And I do not want you to be mad at me. My job is to make recommendations for your kid's health. And I know you want that, but I have zero control over insurance.
Yeah.
So clearly that's going to be a sticking point for you. We're going to stop this appointment and then we will reschedule you on a day. I'm going to give you all the codes and then you make sure that insurance, because it's your contract with them.
Right.
We have stopped the appointment. Every now and then there'll be somebody who says, yes, I'm going to cancel.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.
Whether they come back or not, I don't know.
That's right.
But the ones that proceed, then I go in and I make a note and I have the parents sign that too. I write it on the same sheet. Dad, we discussed insurance, whatever. Dad and Dr. Kuba discussed blah, 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 blah. Mom and Dr. No, ma'am.
Yeah.
It is clearly documented on the consent form in the notes.
Yeah.
We have a pop-up flag. There's no reason for you to proceed with this appointment if you're not comfortable with any part of it and you're not comfortable with the finances. But sir, if I was you, the worst case scenario is if insurance doesn't pick any of this up for your cleaning and x-rays today, this is going to be $345. And if you are not prepared to pay that, we need to cancel the appointment right now. And then we reschedule you.
Yeah. After you've had time to talk to your insurance company.
Because they keep changing their mind for what we do. And I do not want you upset at me for something that I have no control over.
Yes.
Now, I will say, the majority of our patients, like I said before, can't afford it.
Yeah.
They just don't want to pay for it because they feel they're entitled to what they paid for, which is their insurance benefit. So the majority will keep the appointment and we don't hear a peep out of them. But there is the subset that is going to be hot and bothered if they pay for $1 of that.
Yep.
But I'm not writing that off, sir.
No.
This is what you will be liable for. And I put all that in my documentation. Like, this is the worst case scenario you've got. And I will be writing off not one penny.
That's right.
So don't even ask.
Yeah.
So,
well, and in that way, you're trying to nip it in the bud at the beginning to the point that you're willing to let that patient walk out the door. You're sending a very clear message to the patient, which says, I cannot play the insurance game. I can't guarantee you anything. I literally know nothing as to what they're going to do. So if that's your expectation of me, I cannot uphold it.
I cannot deliver.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, yes, that's a patient walking out the door, but that is far cheaper than all the other things we've talked about.
Yes.
Whether it's me trying to fight insurance or me trying to appease a patient and writing it off anyway. And now we put a bad taste in their mouth, or we've taught them all you have to do is be a squeaky wheel and we're going to write it off. We've played that game before too. I am not doing it. Life is too short.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
so I just think that's been one strategy. I think we've talked about it in a previous podcast as well about reviews.
Yes.
And anytime we have a patient that complains about a review or a insurance issue, they didn't do a good job of looking at my insurance. You're absolutely right, sir.
Yeah.
We didn't. That's not because I want anybody else who's going to be very adamant about insurance benefits. That's not what I'm choosing to spend our staff's time on. So if that is a big deal to you, we made the estimate as best as we could, but that's not the goal of our practice. Our goal is to provide quality care.
Right.
And not fight with your insurance company. So I'm very clear about that, because any other patient reading that review who's going to side with the person, then you're not going to be happy in my practice.
Yeah, don't come.
Why should I stress out every day and hit my head against a wall, not knowing what you're going to have a tantrum about, what you're going to write a bad review about, what you're going to complain to the board about, it is just not worth it to me. So we make a very big deal about anybody who says, I only want to pay, I don't want to pay anything not covered by insurance. Whoa! Yeah. Let's stop the appointment. Let's cancel the appointment. Go home. Here's the codes. You figure it out.
And I think that's a really good strategy. It applies to a lot of different scenarios, because it could apply to that new patient that's calling in, and they're immediately from the get-go, how much will this visit be, and how much is my insurance going to pay, and all that. I mean, we could stop the conversation right there, because we can already see the writing on the wall. Mm-hmm. We are no longer able to be successful in those insurance estimates. It's very hard. And I've had practices that have had a perfected system on verification, and they are like, we are drowning here. We don't know what to do. So I think it's such a tale for, we've got to be clear. We've got to be upfront. We've got to draw the line in the sand that just goes, oh no, if you're expecting us to know how your insurance works, we do not know that. We can clinically tell you exactly what's recommended for your patient, for your child, but we cannot tell you how insurance is going to play that game. I think this also ties to something, kind of a soapbox that I've always stood on, and I feel like there's a little bit of a silver lining in this conversation, which is, historically, the dental field has married too often clinical recommendations with insurance coverage. It has been just something that has driven me absolutely batty. We bring a clinical recommendation forward, and either we connect it with what insurance is covering, or we somehow immediately talk about what insurance is covering in that same conversation. And it's always driven me crazy, because medically that hardly ever happens, right? We don't go to the cardiologist and he says, hey, I need to do an echocardiogram, and we go, great, tell me how much it's going to be. We just go, yes, sir. We'll do it. And then we figure out the financial component of it. So it's driven me crazy that dentistry has always towed this line, or married two things that absolutely should not be married.
We've not done ourselves a service.
No.
The profession of service. Yeah.
No. And it's muddied the clinical waters. And I think that has bothered me for so many years. Well, now we're at a point where we cannot stay connected. The clinical guidelines that are guiding insurance companies are not what most clinical providers in the real world sitting in front of the patient would actually recommend. How many clinical providers are going to go, you're absolutely right, let's go ahead and do your perio maintenance today, and it would be much better for you clinically to come back and get that fluoride. No clinical provider is going to say that. That is what insurance is calling the clinical best, and that makes absolutely no sense. So it is this divorce that needs to happen, where we go, you know what? No. I'm not even thinking about what insurance is going to say on this. It's not a part of what enters my brain when I am talking my clinical recommendation with this patient, and we've got to make that line more clear.
So to kind of wrap this up here, I guess my question to you is now, so where are you going with this? Are you saying that maybe participating in PPO is not a good idea? Or are you saying maybe not giving estimates is a good idea? Or what is your...
Yeah. So I would say my challenge to everybody listening would be, I would take the time to think about the risk of potentially dropping a plan. It is just like your decision. Any decision that you make regarding insurance, whether it's to stay in network or to get out of network, it's going to be a risk either way you go. So if you haven't ever paused long enough to go, should I remain in network? Pause.
Pause and consider that. That doesn't mean you have to do a massive drop of all plans. That means you can be very strategic with which plans you choose to drop, if any. If you want to start with kind of the lowest strategy, start with the one that's going to impact the least amount of patients. You know what? I've got Humana and I've got 80 patients on that. So you know what? Let's start with that one. Let's test the waters with that one. Let's get our strategy perfected on how we drop and how we communicate with the patients on this that have this plan. And then if that worked well, we were able to retain a good bit of those patients. We were able to have really good conversations. I think we could do another one.
So would that be a 3-month, a 6-month?
Normally I say 6 months. If we're going with an uber conservative strategy, you start with your smallest company. And then you start with a 6-month timeline, because then you've had a chance to see how many of those I'm using Humana as an example, but those 80 patients from Humana, how many did we retain? So if we talk about the math of it, let's say we're in network with Humana and consistently we write off 50% of our fees. Then we break even if in 6 months we retained 40 of the 80 patients. We're absolutely neutral. We didn't lose money. We lost patients. We lost 40 patients, but we made the same amount of money on those 40 patients. So 6 months is a good timeline to see how effective we were at retaining, because the strategy, of course, is to try to keep the patients, even though we're no longer in network with their company. Let's say we get to 6 months and we lost all 80 patients. We lost every single one of them. Maybe we want to give ourselves a longer rope and we go, you know what, let's figure out, we got to change our verbiage. We got to change how we talked with the patients about that. So we kind of troubleshoot before we drop another one. If you want to go more aggressive, then I would say start with your lowest paying company, no matter how big the company is. You know what? MetLife, consistently, we are reimbursed at dismal rates. So I'm going to drop that one. And yes, we've got 800 patients on that. But you know what? We're going with that one. And then I would still give the same 6-month timeline. I wouldn't do another drop until you're able to see how much you were able to retain from that. So yes, I think it doesn't mean from this conversation that you have to drop. It just means you should at least stop and consider it. Don't just continue in the rat race without pausing to consider, do I need to drop a plan? I think the other thing that I would say is an absolute must for every single person listening to this episode is you've got to change the way that you're talking about insurance in your office. You've got to reevaluate it, not only now, but constantly. How is my treatment coordinator talking about it? How am I, as the doctor, talking about insurance? How are my staff members communicating about it? To me, it's one of those things we've got to have more consistent conversations about our conversation and how it's connected with insurance. So whether or not you choose to consider dropping a PPO plan, that's fine. How we talk about insurance going forward, we are at kind of a fork in the road, and we have got to divorce this connection that insurance and dentistry has always had. It's no longer connected. We're on two different paths. We no longer see eye to eye when it comes to insurance, and we've got to make that more clear in our communication in the office. Would you agree with that?
I would. Insurance, yucky.
I know, right? Right? It's a necessary evil. We got to talk about it. So thanks for giving us your thoughts on the whole process and for sharing the big risk that you took in dropping Medicaid. I feel like on the other side of it, you would say it was absolutely the right decision, right?
Oh my gosh, 1,000%, like zero regrets.
Yep.
And even, the joy of going to the OR, I guess I just didn't know myself that much. I haven't even missed that at all yet. So,
no, right?
No, 1,000%. Yes, it was the right thing to do, but it's funny where you say, that was a big risk, and I never even saw it as a big risk, because to me it was just sink or swim in the moment. I couldn't even see beyond the fog. Yeah. So it's a good thing that it worked out.
Yeah, and you're on the other side of it, having experienced the success of that. So way to go. Way to be a risk taker.
Thanks for joining the conversation today. We hope that you are comforted in knowing that you are not alone. But we also hope that you're walking away with some really great tips and tricks to try in your practice. We value your feedback, so please take a few moments to rate and review the podcast. Finally, we want to make sure that we're covering the topics that matter to you. So track us down on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and let us know what topics you want us to cover. As always, please know that we are rooting for you today as you manage your dental drama.